President, I want to talk for a few moments about income tax filing season. I realize, Mr. President of the Senate, that you would probably prefer to be condemned to hearing OJ jokes for the rest of eternity than to hear me talk about federal income tax filing, but it's important for Americans and my people back in Louisiana because we have a new deduction for people who have uninsured losses from natural disasters. And it's really important in my state because many of my people have suffered damages for which they did not receive insurance payments from Hurricanes Laura, Delta, Ida, and Francine. We passed this new deduction, Mr. President, in December. It's called the Federal Disaster Tax Relief Act. And what it does is following. It changes the law. It now says that if you're a victim of a natural disaster like a hurricane and you have a loss that's not paid for by your insurance, you can now deduct off your income tax, dollar for dollar, any property damage, uninsured property damage, in excess of $500. Why is that important? Well, under the old rules, Mr. President, you were limited in your deduction. You could only deduct your uninsured property losses that were in excess of 10% of your adjusted gross income. And I know that sounds complicated, and it is kind of complicated. But rather than belaboring the point, the bottom line is this. As a result of this bill that we all worked on and that we passed, you can now deduct more. And this is the first time people will be able to do this. So let me say it again. If you had an uninsured property loss, you can now deduct any of that loss above $500. This also applies in addition to the standard deduction. So if you take the standard deduction, as most Americans do, you can take this additional deduction on top of it. I'd also like to point out, Mr. President, to all Americans, but especially to my people back home in Louisiana, that this tax deduction is retroactive. It goes all the way back to 2020. So that means that going back to 2020, if you had uninsured losses, you can now deduct them if they exceed $500. And I know folks are thinking, well, I already filed my income taxes for 2021 and 2022 and 2023. You can file an amended return. It's very simple to do. You just file an amended return that says there's been a change in the law and I'm entitled to have this higher deduction, and therefore the federal government owes me money, and therefore please send me my check. So I wanted to make sure that Americans knew about this new tax provision that we passed. The second thing I want to talk about, Mr. President, is a subject that some people want to avoid, but I don't, and the American people don't. It's on the minds of every American. That's high prices. And I know there are other issues that are important that we're talking about. Male athletes in women's sports, that's important. Immigration, that's important. National security, we're talking about that, that's important. The Middle East, Ukraine. And I could go on, but the single most important issue that moms and dads worry about in America today when they lie down to sleep at night and can't is inflation, high prices. I don't want to dwell on the past, But President Biden's administration was an inflation machine. We saw inflation get as high at one point as 10%. What's that mean? It means that prices were going up every day, every month, at the rate of 10% annualized. Bidenomics, in most people's minds, became paying more to live worse. I mean, inflation just was gutting the American people like a fish. And it happened because of all this breathtaking amount of money that President Biden's administration spent, trillions of dollars. The American Rescue Plan, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. They injected trillions of dollars into the economy. Frankly, as we're finding out now, most of it in wasteful spending that caused too many dollars to chase too few goods. And unless you're master class dumb, you know that every single time that leads to inflation. Thanks to the efforts of the Federal Reserve, inflation came down. It went down from 10% to today it's between 2 and 3%, depending on whose numbers you believe. And that's good. I'm happy it happened. That's called disinflation. When inflation goes from 10% to 3%, that means prices are still rising, but they're just not rising as quickly as they were, and that's a good thing. But it doesn't lower prices. It doesn't mean that we have now lower prices. They just aren't as high as they would have been if we hadn't tried to control inflation. That's called disinflation. Deflation is when prices actually go down. Deflation is when prices actually go down. And what the American people are wondering every single day as they sell blood plasma to go to the grocery store is, when am I going to get some relief from these high prices? And we do need to provide them relief. I want to talk about 3 ways that we are in the process of trying to reduce those prices that my Democratic colleagues caused. And I don't mean to pick on all my Democratic colleagues, but as I've said before, Mr. President, I like breakfast food and straight answers. And no economist in America believes that this inflation happened as a result of happenstance. It happened because of the breathtaking amount of money that President Biden spent. There are 3 things that we're doing to try to get these prices down. Number 1, reduce spending. You see it every single day from President Trump. He said he was going to audit federal spending, and that's exactly what he's doing. Now, there's some people that are mad. There are people that are very mad at President Trump and Mr. Musk and others for discovering all this waste. The people who are mad don't seem to be mad at the people who caused the waste. They're mad at the president and Mr. Musk for finding the waste. I find that a little bit ironic. But the point is, we're trying to reduce spending. And you're going to see it in our reconciliation bill that we're going to pass, as you know, Mr. President. You're going to see it in our budget if we ever pass one. We're trying to reduce spending because our debt's $36 trillion. And it's going up at the rate of $7 million a minute. I don't know, I've been talking 5 minutes maybe. It rose $35 million while I was talking. So we're trying to reduce government spending to get this debt down, but also to reduce our prices. Why does it matter? Because the less money that government spends, the less stimulative government is on the private sector. And when government spends money, there's a finite amount of money. When government spends money, it's money that we're spending instead of the private sector to create jobs, to increase wages. So the first thing we're doing, the new administration and the new Congress, is to try to reduce spending. And if we're successful, that will lower these prices. Number 2, deregulation. The federal government wants to regulate every breath we take. Every breath we take. I wish you could see all of the federal regulations. If you stacked them right here, if you stacked every single federal regulation right here, you could probably stand on that thing and paint the ceiling. It's just amazing. And each one of these regulations has a cost. The cost of all of our regulations today is in excess of $2 trillion. Not billion, not million, $2 trillion. What does that mean? That means when a business produces a product or it delivers a service and it has to comply with a meaningless, gnarly federal regulation, which costs money, that extra expense is added to the cost of the product or the service. Duh. I mean, businesses have to stay in business. They can't eat the cost. So they pass it on. And that leads to higher prices. So the second thing that we're doing, we're working on it every day. It hasn't been talked about a lot. We've passed some bills here on the floor of the Senate, but the administration's doing even more. We're deregulating. We're getting rid of all of these excess regulations whose costs are greater than their benefit. And I think the president has said he's got a new rule that if you're in the bureaucracy and you want to promulgate a new rule, you can do it if it's really necessary, but you got to get rid of 10 others. If we do that successfully, that will reduce prices. So the first thing we're doing is cutting spending to get down these high prices. The second thing we're doing is implementing federal deregulation. The third thing that we're doing, we're working on it as we speak, as you know, Mr. President. We've got to grow this economy. I mentioned the high spending and the debt that's led to higher prices. Think about this. Since 2019, 5 years ago, the American population's increased 2%. The federal budget has increased 55%. 2% population increase, federal spending's up 55%. That's just a fact. The numbers are the numbers. Now, I know we've had some inflation, but we haven't had 55% worth of inflation. That's just a fact. And every dollar that the federal government spends is a dollar that business people don't have to invest. Why is that important? Because they invest, they grow their business, they add more jobs, the business becomes more profitable, and wages rise. So the third way we're attacking these high prices is by trying to stimulate the economy to increase wages so that we actually can grow out of these high prices, so that people will have more money to spend when they buy a car or go to the grocery store. We're not going to do that with tepid GDP growth. If you go back to 2010, 15 years now, America has experienced average gross domestic product growth. That means how much your economy is growing, as you know, Mr. President. Average GDP growth of a little over 2%. That's not going to get it. That's not going to get it. In fact, now when we have 2.5% GDP growth, we get so excited, we're so happy, we want to have a toga party. 2.5% is not going to get it. In order to grow out of these high prices and increase wages, we're going to have to increase GDP growth to at least 3%. And that used to be normal for America. That used to be very, very doable and very normal. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that through the tax code, Mr. President. We have about $4.5 trillion worth of tax cuts that we implemented back in 2017. that caused the economy to grow and wages to go up until COVID hit. Those tax cuts are expiring here very shortly, and we're going to extend them. If we don't, it'll be, in effect, a tax increase of about $4.5 trillion. And that'll send our growth down, not up. We're also going to change some other provisions of the tax code. And in doing so, we're not going to add to our deficit. We're going to match those tax decreases with spending savings so that we do not add to the national debt. And that's what we're doing on inflation. And I didn't want this to be lost in translation and because of all the other important things we're talking about. We're well aware that high prices are gutting the American people like a fish. But by reducing spending, by deregulating the economy, and by designing a tax code that looks like somebody designed it on purpose, we're going to get those high prices down. Point 3, put up that other chart. Mr. President, speaking of saving money, I've talked a little bit about public radio and public television in America. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, NPR, PBS. These are public TV and radio stations. American people spend about $500 million a year, give it directly to public TV. They give it to Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Corporation for Public Broadcasting picks its favorite local TV stations and radio stations, gives money to them, and the local TV and radio stations buy programming from NPR and PBS, which is loosely affiliated with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And there was a time when it was necessary because we only had 3 TV stations and a few radio stations, and people in rural areas depended on the government for their media. Those days are long gone, as we know. We now have a breathtaking array of ways to get information, everything from podcasts to Facebook to Twitter to Google News to cable TV to streaming. We no longer need to spend $500 million a year, or $500 billion a year. We've spent $14.5 billion since we started funding public radio and television. We no longer need to do it. I mean, we don't fund CNN. We don't subsidize CNN. And if somebody proposed to, I'd vote against it. We don't subsidize Fox News. If somebody introduced a bill to subsidize Fox News, I'd vote against it. Why are we subsidizing these radio and television stations? They need to compete with everybody else. The final point I want to make on this subject, Mr. President, the audience for public radio and public television is declining. Let me say that again. The audience for public radio and public television, which your tax dollars pay for, is declining. Why is that? There are a lot of reasons for it, but I'll tell you one. People used to tune in to PBS and NRP and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Freudian slip there, because those stations played it right straight down the middle. But they don't anymore. They're very, very biased in their reporting. We all know that. I mean, all you have to do is listen to them. Now, this is America. You're entitled. I despise opinion journalism, but it's constitutional. Under the First Amendment, you can say what you want within reason, and you're not. And I support that. You're not free if you can't say what you think. So I don't want you to misconstrue what I'm saying, Mr. President. These local stations that are getting money from the taxpayers have every right to report what they want. But they don't have a right to do it and offer a jaundiced point of view using taxpayer dollars. That's my point. And I just wanted to, as I've done in the past, I just wanted to read a few more headlines. This is the kind of reporting that's being done today with your tax money on NPR, National Public Radio, and PBS. I'll start with NPR. Here's one of the headlines at NPR. Arguments that trans athletes have an unfair advantage lack evidence to support. That's opinion journalism. Here's another headline from NPR. A brief history of how racism shaped interstate highways. I did not know our interstate highways were racist. I thought they were concrete, but not according to NPR. Here's another NPR headline. Trump embodies nearly every aspect of a racist, Arthur says. Another, The Nation, confronting Trump's coded racism. Another, is Trump's call for law and order a coded racial message? As I said, these are your tax dollars at work. Sexism is out in the open in the 2016 campaign. That may have been inevitable. It's another headline. Is Trump really that racist? Another headline. Another headline, Frontline traces the ambition and revenge driving SCOTUS Justice Clarence Thomas. NPR is reporting that Justice Thomas is motivated by revenge and ambition. Another headline from NPR. What can the White House do to confront the narrative around Biden's ability? It wasn't a narrative. I don't hate anybody, and I'm sorry this was the case, but President Biden had neurodegenerative disease. It wasn't a narrative, it was just a fact. I'm sorry, but it was just a fact. Last headline from NPR I'll read. Scientists start to tease out the subtler ways racism hurts health. Your tax dollars at work. Now, I don't want to just pick on NPR. Here are a couple that you saw on that you saw on television, PBS, paid for with your tax dollars. First headline, talking to young children about race and racism. Another headline, how America's history of racism connects to divisions today. Another headline from PBS, the hidden racism of young white Americans. Your tax dollars. Another headline, AP fact check. Trump seeds race animus with COVID falsehood. Another headline, Biden trumpets economic gains but struggles to get credit. Another headline from PBS, the other Olympians, transgender athletes in the Nazi area. Come on. Give me a break. Gag me with a spoon. And the final headline I'll read, debunking common myths about gender-affirming care for youth. Now, let me say it again, Mr. President. These television stations and radio stations that are getting money from the federal government, your tax dollars they have every right under the First Amendment to say these things. They do. And I support the First Amendment. But they don't have an inalienable right to report these things using opinion journalism that no fair-minded American can construe as anything but representing one point of view with your tax dollars. I'm I'm going to try to stop subsidizing media, not just PBS and not just NPR, but any form of media that somehow is getting federal taxpayer dollars. It's just not right. It's not fair. I have a bill to do that, and we're also going to pursue it through reconciliation. And I think President Trump and Mr. Musk are going to pursue it on their own, and I think that's a very good thing. And with that, Mr. President, I thank you for your time and attention, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.